Okay, good morning. Last time we were looking at the AFM at the AFM directive. Sorry, at the UCITS directive. I'm getting mixed up. We were looking at the UCITS directive, and so let me check for the class attendance. 1 minute, because I haven't started that already. Okay. It's not working. Okay, I will try later for the class attendance. But by the way, we were looking at these two slides on the structure of UCITS funds, and we had to now sort of take a look at the authorization regime of the management company under the UCITS directive. We will have two groups presenting this morning. Just let me check the calendar. Yeah, so we have the first group on the European, two groups on the EBA, European Banking Authority, the first EBA as a regulator and the second EBA as a supervisor. So as usual, I will speak for the first 30 minutes. So I would kindly request the first group, Leonardo, Edoardo, Eugenio, and Cesare, to be ready by 10:50 sharp, upload their presentation. And then I will speak for another 30 minutes. So this will lead us to 11:35. And this is when the second group, Andrea, Orazio, Nicolò, and Giulio, should be ready to provide their presentation. Okay, so we'll have a full overview of the European Banking Authority with these two groups focusing on different topics. And today we're going to look at the end of the UCITS part, the UCITS directive, and we will also go through the AFMD directive. Now, it is important for you to understand very well the UCITS approach and the UCITS directive, because you will see that most of the things that you find in UCITS will be replicated in the AFM environment. So you have a sort of, in Italian we say that you catch two pigeons with a single bean. And it is effectively so, but you have to realize, you will see this today, that the AFM has a different approach vis-a-vis the UCITS. But basically, if you study, if you understand it well, you will be in a position to also understand the AFM pretty well too. So the access to providing fund management services in the EU is regulated under the UCITS directive in terms which are very similar to the things that you saw in the banking part of the course and the investment services part as well. So providers of these fund management services are the people who will set up and manage funds, UCITS funds in the EU, and similarly to what you have already seen, these entities need to be provided with a license, an authorization granted by the competent authority of their own home member state. And this is the country where they are based and located. And then once they got this license, they would be able to use the European passport. Now, the particular thing of the UCITS directive is that, as I already told you, this European passport will be applicable to the fund manager that, as a legal entity, will be able to provide its services on a cross-border basis. So, for instance, a fund manager based in Luxembourg, by using its European passport, may manage a fund which is based in Italy or in another country. But the passport also applies to the product. So this means that UCITS funds, as I already told you, will be marketable all across the European Union. Sorry, I I just want you to take a look at, as we proceed, I'm sending you a link to two videos, very short, that I will tell you to upload in due time, but just to catch up some time. This is the first video. I will ask you to upload it at the end of this first part of my presentation, together with this second video. Okay, but I will tell you when you have to kick off. So this European passport applies to the management company and to the product as well, and the criteria for obtaining the authorization under the UCITS regime are very close to the ones that you saw in the banking and investment services. So what would you expect to find? Obviously, you would find minimum capital requirements, honorability experience of the management company's manager. You would find requisites in terms of honorability and transparency of the relevant shareholder. So the typical fit and proper and suitability requirements that you would find in the banking or in the investment services directive. So the approach is similar, but naturally the rules that in detail apply to managers falling under the UCITS are not necessarily the same. As you might imagine, these requirements in the context of EU financial legislation tend to be tougher for banks, and as you move down the line, they are at an intermediate stage for investment firms, and fund managers are subject to lighter requirements, for instance, in terms of corporate capital, because they, due to what you saw in these slides, where you have this segregated pool of assets, which are the funds, they raise less issues in terms of prudential and minimum capital requirements, because the fund is segregated and it's a separate entity that does not really imply that the fund manager as such has huge own funds, as instead is the case for a bank or also for an investment service provider that holds positions vis-a-vis open positions vis-a-vis the market. The UCITS companies can also, UCITS fund management companies, apart from being authorized to set up and manage UCITS funds, can also provide additional services. And this slide provides you the basic information that you need in this respect. There are three different additional services that UCITS companies may provide. Two of them fall under MiFID, so they can provide individual portfolio management and also investment advice. This slide is a little bit outdated. I think it just remained there since I prepared them for the first time, because it still considers that investment advice is a non-core service vis-a-vis MiFID, but we know that investment advice now is an investment service, so don't just forget about that and cut this off. This would be investment advice, but it doesn't make any difference. I mean, what we're saying is that a UCITS fund management company may also provide two investment services in addition to managing funds, and these are portfolio, individual management, and investment advice. And also, as you see in the first paragraph of the slide, under conditions, a UCITS fund manager may also manage funds which are not covered by the UCITS directive, but this is valid if and only if the management company is the management company of the fund which is being managed is subject to prudential supervisions, and the units of these funds, which are not UCITS funds, obviously, cannot be marketed in other member states under the UCITS directive. It's quite restrictive, and in fact, it is rarely used, especially today, because if a fund management company wants to manage funds that do not fall within the scope of the UCITS directive, it does not actually use this provision, but it uses the provisions of the AFM directive. So it would get a license under that directive. So this provision is still there in the UCITS directive, but it is now overrun by the AFM directive. As I already told you on Monday, the custodian or the depository bank plays a very important role in the context of the UCITS directive. It is in fact the institution that physically safekeeps the assets of the fund. And if you think about it, this sort of realizes in full what you have seen in these slides, where you see that the fund is a pool of assets which is managed by the management company. And this slide gives you a visual representation of that makes you understand that the fund is separate from the management company's own funds. And this separation is not only because there are rules that prevent the fund from being seized by creditors of the management company. Creditors of the management company cannot seize the assets of the fund, and creditors of Fund 1 cannot seize the assets of Fund 2. So there's a segregation, legally speaking, rules that protect these assets from being seized by creditors of other parties. But not just that, the custodian or the depository also sort of puts this into concrete practice, because the assets are physically taken out of the hands of the management company, and they are entrusted with a third party, which is the depository bank. So, and this is probably one of the strongest measures of investor protection that you find in the context of European financial fund management legislation. As we will see, it has been taken up by the AFM there as well. So it now applies to any fund which falls under European legislation. The custodian bank has very strict and strong duties and also liabilities, so it must be an entity which is subject to prudential regulation, specific prudential regulation. The legislation requires that the depositories have a huge capital, because they may face liabilities towards the fund and the investors. And so there's just a small number of providers of these services across the European Union. It's the biggest banks that can do so. We will see that the AFM directive has opened up this role of depository not just to banks, but also to investment firms and UCITS management companies. But we will see this in the next set of slides. But this is rarely I really do not know of anybody who has chosen as an investment firm or as a UCITS company to act as a custodian for other funds, because it is very, very, very capital intensive, and so it is probably a provision that is rarely used. I really don't know whether somebody in Europe is using this possibility. So it is still, as a matter of fact, correct to say depository bank rather than depository institution or simply custodian, because effectively deposit custodians are on the market. They are banks because of these big prudential requirements that are implied. So as I told you, the first duty of these depository institutions is to safekeep the assets of the fund. Each fund must have a single custodian. So it's not possible to sort of distribute the role of the custodian among different institutions. It is mandatory to have one depository for each fund. And this is, once again, a measure of investor protection, because by doing so, there is a clear cut in sort of setting out of the responsibilities and liabilities of these custodians, so that they do not get dispersed among more than one custodian at the same time. And there are also limitations as to the possibility for the funds that are deposited with the custodian to be used for the benefit of the depository or of any third party to which the functions have been eventually delegated. It is obviously necessary that most of the times the custodian appoints sub-custodians down the line for assets. For instance, if you have assets that are based in other countries, the custodian would need to appoint a sub-custodian locally. But basically, the assets cannot be used for their own benefit or for their interest of the depository or the sub depositories. There's just one exception that you see in the second part of the slide, but this is subject to 4 conditions which are very restrictive. First of all, what do I mean by using the assets for the benefit of the depository? Well, you can think of, as you see in Article 22 of UCITS, you can think of lending these assets through, for instance, a stock lending agreement, or pledging the assets, using them as a collateral to cover guarantees or to provide guarantees for transactions which are being placed on the market, and or even transferring these assets to somebody with eventually a buyback provision, such as repurchase agreements. You cannot do this unless the 4 conditions that you see in the slide are complied with. And more specifically, these transactions are allowed only if they are made for the account of the UCITS, upon instruction of the relevant management company. They must be in the interest of the unit holders, so these have to be checked in terms of the result that they provide, and this result must be in the clear interest of the unit holders. And when the assets are taken out of the segregated accounts and, for instance, lent to somebody else through a stock lending or a repurchase transaction, they have to be backed up by sufficient high liquid and high quality collateral. So it's an exception which is quite restrictive, as you see. And the main duties of the depository bank is to perform their duty to safekeep, but they also have a duty to monitor the functions of the management company. Now, there's a question coming up. Ricardo is rightly raising an interesting point. He's saying, should it be considered more prudential to diversify custodian? This has been, it's a very good question, Ricardo, and thank you for taking this up. It is debated, in fact, and the pros and cons of this have been considered over time. And ultimately, the position that we have in the EU is that a single custodian with very big prudential requirements is better than dispersing the safekeeping of the assets between different custodians. And this is because if something goes wrong, if you have more than one custodian, it may be difficult to allocate liabilities and responsibilities. You also have, so instead of having, let's say, 5, 6, 7, 8 custodians with lower prudential requirements on top concerning each of these, we have a single custodian with higher prudential requirements. But I must say that since Ricardo is taking up this very interesting point of discussion, there are some exceptions that sort of make you understand how complex the topic is. First of all, the first exception is sub-custodians, because in the any custodian of an investment fund needs to appoint sub-custodians, especially, as I told you, on local markets where they are not present in themselves. So ultimately, you have a diversification of custody of the fund's assets, but substantially you have more custodians in place, but the sub-custodian system ensures that the entry point for supervisors and for liabilities is just the main custodian. The second exception relates to the AFM directive, because in the AFMD, for all of those funds that do not fall within the scope of the UCITS directive, we now see that a custodian is necessary as well. But there is an exception, and the exception relates to liquidity, cash, because in the AFMD, cash can eventually be, it's up to the management company to decide this, but cash can be entrusted to another legal entity. And it can be a normal bank, which simply holds the cash, or it may another service provider. For instance, in the area of hedge funds, we have a specific, the market calls these people prime brokers that provide prime brokerage services to hedge funds. And the prime brokerage services frequently imply that the prime broker, which is the entity that then places the orders on the market, carries out the transactions, holds liquidity on behalf of the fund. And this is not the custodian, it's another entity that holds liquidity for the fund. And in the AFM directive, we have this exemption or exception to the general principle of having a single custodian. And then as I speak of the alternative funds, and there is also another major sort of exception to the principle of a unique depository bank that applies to assets that cannot be physically entrusted to the custodian bank. Okay, and if you think about it, the most striking case is obviously real estate funds, because real estate funds that fall outside the scope of UCITS but are alternative funds and therefore are regulated by the AFM directive, really you cannot really entrust a real estate to a bank. And so for all of these funds, the custodian must essentially limits its functions to the financial instruments or eventually to the cash which is entrusted to the custodian bank. So there are exceptions, but the principle is that we prefer to have a single custodian with a huge capital and prudential supervision, very strong prudential supervision, rather than more than one custodian. And if you look at the duties that the custodian must carry on when it comes to monitoring the functioning of the fund, they're quite comprehensive. And basically, you can simply forget about the first 4 paragraphs, just concentrate on the last one and read it in this way. It's much easier than what you find on this slide. Instead of reading, ensure that a common fund's income is applied, you can simply say, ensure that the common fund's assets are managed in accordance with. So this is much easier than sort of trying to remember all the single points of this slide, because this is what effectively legislation requires upon custodian banks. They must control and supervise what the fund manager is doing, and if something goes wrong, they are liable. Now, since Ricardo raised this interesting question, you may wonder what happens when the assets of the fund cannot physically be entrusted with the custodian, for instance, real estate. How can you combine the liability of the custodian with the fact that the assets are not in the hands of the custodian? And the answer to this question is that even if the assets are not physically kept by the custodian bank must be in a position to control the transactions that are carried out on those assets. So for instance, if the management company sells a real estate, a building, this will be done by the management company, but then when the price has to be paid, the transaction is settled, and then the transaction must be checked by the custodian bank, who must verify that the transaction is okay and it is in line with the rules applicable to the fund. Now, the last 2 slides basically repeat everything that we've been saying in terms of passporting the funds and the management company under the UCITS directive. This slide gives you a visual representation of something that you're very familiar with. It is how the European passport works. It works exactly as it works in the banking and in the investment services field. So the management company wishing, this slide refers to the distribution of the fund's units. Okay, so what you end up by having is that the fund is sold on the host member state market, and you have a notification to the home member state, which then notifies the intention of the management company to use the European passport to the host member state, and then the management company would be able to offer and market the product in host member states. And the same applies when the marketing does not refer to units of the fund, but to the services provided by the management company, which would then be able to manage funds in another EU country. Okay, so just 2 minutes on the first video. You can click on the link. It will open up straight away. And then 2 minutes on the other video. And then we start with the presentation. Okay, I don't want to take up too much time with the videos. I want to comply with my duty to start the presentation of the first group at 10:50. We may have time to look at the second short video later on, but if you think that these videos are useful, I think they are very useful and they're very well done. They're short and they're clear enough. You can find a whole list of them by simply following the YouTube links to the website, to the YouTube channel of the Luxembourg Association of Investment Funds, and there's a series of 6 or 7 short videos on the UCITS fund industry that they basically repeat what I have been saying. So it's just a way of recap if you're interested. So let's start with the first presentation. EBA.
Yeah. Good morning, Professor. Can you hear me?
Yeah, very well.
Yeah. Okay. So just 1 minute. Should I share a PDF or a PowerPoint file?
I think PowerPoint doesn't work on the Blackboard, the platform. It's a mystery,
Okay,
but
so
I always have to convert the PowerPoint to PDF. But you can try. Eventually, you may be more successful than I have been.
Okay, it is uploading the.
Yeah, this is a suggestion also for other groups. You should. It's safer if you convert from PowerPoint to PDF because Blackboard is.
Can you see it now?
Yeah, it's perfect.
It's perfect. Okay, so I'm also sharing the video. Does it work? I don't know.
Yeah, it works. We can see.
Okay. So can the other guys switch slide, or I should do it? So can I start?
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so good morning, everyone. In our presentation, we aim to analyze EBA's roles, functions, and powers in the context of the banking union, with a focus on its regulatory role. So as you can see from the agenda, we'd like to first give an overview of EBA role and why it is so important nowadays. In order to do so, we need to make a step back to the beginning of the economic crisis of 2008, which brought about a pivotal change in the structure of the single market. Initially, in fact, it was based on the two pillars of mutual recognition and minimum harmonization, whose flaws, however, were revealed by the crisis mostly through two channels that we can see here. First, loopholes and regulatory arbitrage. So the fact that the crisis pressured national regulation as a competitive lever to support national interests, creating negative externalities, and then the lack of comparability of key prudential aggregates. So the fact that major differences in national definitions and regulations ended up being a major obstacle for an effective coordination during a crisis. Generally, we can say that a long-term market integration, together with a single monetary policy, were clearly unachievable whilst keeping regulation and supervision at national levels. After 2008, so with the De Larosière report of 2009, policymakers were prompted to create a new framework based on the creation of a single set of EU rules that basically had two main features. First, they were applicable in all member states, and second, they without the need of a national transposition. So this basically consisted in the creation of the single rulebook. And clearly, EBA is essential because its main task is to contribute to the creation of the single rulebook, whilst at the same time maintaining financial stability and ensuring prudential regulation. So what is the main problem that it solves? Basically, through the definition of common regulatory aggregates and key requirements, now the directives are no longer implemented very differently in the different member states as it used to be. In the following slide, we can have a picture of the toolkit, heterogeneous toolkit of EBA. On the left, we have the technical standards belonging to the level 2 of Lamfalussy approach. So EBA elaborates these draft technical standards, which are then approved by the Commission. And for this reason, we talk about quasi-regulatory powers. In theory, their content should be exclusively technical. However, we know that in practice, this is not the case, since they always at least partially imply strategic and policy choices, because of course they inevitably establish a ranking among interests. However, it is safe to say that the consistency with the treaties is always respected, because first, we have no full-fledged delegation, and second, the Commission in any case retains the power of scrutiny and also of endorsement. On the right, we can see the guidelines, recommendations, and Q&A that instead belong to the level 3 of the Lamfalussy approach, and they are classified as soft law instruments, so they are not formally binding, but increasingly important. The rationale of guidelines is that legal provisions are interpreted and applied very differently on a country basis because of differences in national legislation, of course. So through guidelines, the EBA makes sure that the member states adhere to common criteria to ensure effective implementation of banking regulation. Clearly, the authorities have to make every effort to comply, and within 2 months state whether they intend or not to comply, providing reasons for justifications. Q&A concern answers provided by the EBA on the interpretation of L1 and L2 provisions, so that they ensure a living and evolving framework. As I said, they are not binding, but increasingly important because peer pressure and market discipline play strong drivers. Lastly, it must be highlighted that the focus of the EBA regulation has shifted from the numerator to the denominator of the capital ratio, as we can see in the bottom part of the slide, whilst basically immediately after the crisis, the focus was mainly on the definition of funds and liquidity requirements. Risk-weighted asset weights and also the definition of default have progressively gained more attention. We can now switch to the second part.
Good morning. Can you see me?
Everything is perfect. Go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Leonardo. Now let us focus our attention on where this toolkit can be applied, meaning the areas of competence. Briefly, our agenda will include the following the order of the regulation, the occurrence of emergency, the need of supervisions, the definition of systemic risk, its prevention, then the resolution procedure, and ultimately the breach of the union law. Emergency situations are defined by Article 18. They refer to adverse developments which may jeopardize the integrity of the financial market, and the authority shall coordinate any action taken by the national competent authorities. It is not rare that the national supervisory authorities let the EBA participate and observe the relevant gatherings concerning emergency situation. Where the authority considers that an emergency situation may arise, it shall issue a confidential recommendation addressed to the Council and provide it with an assessment of the situation. Moreover, to preserve the orderly function of the financial market, the authority may adopt individual decisions requiring competent authorities to take specific actions. Then, moving to Article 22, the regulation first gives a definition of the systemic risk, and then it describes the procedures undertaken by the authority in order to identify and measure it. Please, guys, remember these two, identification and measurement, the key task of EBA with respect to systemic risk. For instance, it shall develop a common set of quantitative and qualitative indicators, standardize stress testing and permanent capacity, or more simply, provide additional guidelines and recommendations. Once again, a quasi-regulatory power. In the context of supervision, the authority shall play an active role in building the so-called supervisory convergence, which is a convergence between member states, given the fact that they are all subject to different national supervisory authority. The EBA shall foster the development of a common supervisory cultures with commonly agreed rules, ensuring comparability and consistency. The toolkit of EBA as a regulator in the context of supervision is dominated by quasi-regulatory tools. For instance, providing opinions, promoting exchange of information, organizing periodic peers review, or simply establishing training programs. Moreover, the EBA shall participate in the coordination of effective and consistent recovery and resolution plans. Here we have both regulatory levels. It may implement technical standards or simply identify best practices aimed at facilitating the resolution of failing institutions. Finally, Article 81 paves the way to the creation of the European Resolution Fund. Now, I leave the floor to Edoardo, who will give us an overview of the banking union framework.
Okay, thank you, Eugenio. And can you see me?
Yes, we can see you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you, Eugenio. And after a deep discussion of EBA institutional role, it's now time to focus on another important actor of the EU infrastructure, which is the banking union. It was born at the beginning of the last decade, when the second wave of 2008 financial crisis showed how the lack of a uniform harmonization across the banking sector could easily turn a monetary crisis into a fiscal crisis due to the thick net of interconnections among European credit institutions. As a consequence, the banking union was created with the intent of pursuing maximum harmonization and the constructive cooperation among national authorities. Thus, it is based on two main pillars, which are first, the single supervisor mechanism, composed by the ECB and the national authorities of all Eurozone countries and of the spontaneously adhering European non-Euro countries, with the aim of aligning their supervisory procedures. Second, the single resolution mechanism, looking after banks in crisis and minimizing their social cost through the savvy implementation of single resolution fund and single resolution board. Finally, for the sake of completeness, I have to say that there is actually a third pillar, which is the European Deposit Insurance Scheme, which is, however, still under construction. Let's now try to complete the framework talking about the supervisory and regulatory powers within the banking union. Regarding the former, I start highlighting that the supervisory activity is operationally carried out by the SSM, while it formally remains a core competence of the EBA. From a practical perspective, within the SSM, the ECB monitors banks of significant relevance, while the competent national authorities cover less significant banks, even if they can be summoned back by the ECB if needed. The idea, as we said, is to reduce the high level of flexibility with which national competent authorities were used to adopt guidelines and recommendations from EBA before 2008, as you can see in the graph on the right. That attitude not only brought systemic risk in the EU economy, but also provoked a sort of competitive advantages for financial institutions subject to soft touch authorities, provoking a sort of abstentionism spiral. Finally, it is important to notice that the SSM, and thus the ECB, is in charge only of pre-crisis supervision. This means that when a bank turns into crisis, the ECB has the only task to communicate the situation to the SRM, which from that moment on takes the complete authority and autonomy in managing the crisis. On the other hand, ECB is provided by the union law with a set of instruments which basically represent all the regulatory powers conferred to the banking union, excluding resolution powers, which are exclusive competence of the SRM. Those instruments are the typical acts of the EU infrastructures and are regulations, decisions, instructions, recommendations and guidelines with some interesting innovative features, such as the decision without addressees, which can be used and actually are used as a self-binding tool for self-organization, and the binding character of guidelines with a general inclination. ECB has to use those instruments and those powers to regulate a set of well-specified areas of competence, generally related to technical requirements for the banking activity and capital threshold for banks. But now, a question may arise, and that is, who defines those well-specified areas of competence? The answer is the EU through regulators. Indeed, ECB is not a regulator itself. Its powers come from an emanation of the European Commission and Parliament, which gave regulatory autonomy in the boundaries of union law's hierarchy. To say it in other words, the ECB's regulatory powers can never overcome the single rulebook and the regulatory technical standards, which are respectively level 1 and level 2 legislative text issued by the EU Parliament and EBA. Instead, it has to respect the supervisory direction imprinted by these two authorities, and especially EBA. Now that I've hopefully given you a clear understanding of the big picture of the banking union, I'll let Cesare illustrate to you its interactions with EBA. Thank you.
Cheers, Eduardo. Can you see me? Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah.
All right. Good morning, everyone, first of all. Now, since it is the SSM which now takes care of the supervisory convergence across member states, and it's the ECB, on the other hand, that has taken the supervisory leading role over the majority of the banking union assets, the relevance of the EBA as a supervisory convergence and direct enforcement institution is really being questioned now. In this context, the accomplishment of the EBA's existential search in the banking union framework critically depends on its relationship with member states, with the core contention being, do NCAs play a supportive or disruptive role to the EBA's building and enforcing the single rulebook in the area of banking supervision? Now, to a certain extent, the banking union framework has accentuated the weaknesses of the EBA's internal governance, particularly when we speak about the national anchoring of the EBA executive level, thanks to which basically NCAs representing member states practically steer the EBA activities at an horizontal level. As independent national agencies, obviously NCAs tend to be basically driven by their domestic mandate to safeguard domestic policy priorities, and in this sense, some conflicts of interest may arise with the EBA, whose task is, on the other hand, to ensure a common European perspective to policies. At the same time, though, the EBA's close cooperation with frontline supervisors is one of its most important assets in terms of the authority's added value to policymaking on the side of supervision, as it operates again at an horizontal level, developing thus comparable supervisory practices that lead to more consistent outcomes, whereas the banking union acts more as a vertical integrator. However, in some cases, such as the breach of union law, the EBA can actually overcome the banking union powers. As we see in the next slide, when we talk about breach of union law, we're talking about a three-step procedure. In the first place, the EBA chairperson decides whether to investigate over allegedly incorrect or insufficient application of union law obligations by NCAs. Now, moving on to the second step, if the chairperson decides to pursue such investigation, he or she convokes a breach of union law panel whose main tasks are to propose a draft recommendation to the board of supervisors or to close the investigation. If we come to the third and final step, once the full investigation report is filed, the final decision is up to the board of supervisors. Now, here the problem arises again. The EBA's capacity of supervisory enforcement, again, critically depends on the willingness of the board of supervisors to actually act against NCAs. And this is exactly what happened in 2019, as we can see in the Danske Bank case. Now, basically, the EBA in 2019 launched an official investigation against Estonian and Danish competent authorities. And ultimately, the draft recommendation made by the breach of union law panel was rejected by the board of supervisors. And such rejection actually revealed once again the susceptibility of EBA's powers to conflicts of interest, and once again highlighted the adversarial dimension of the EBA member states' relationship in the context of the authority's enforcement powers. Thank you very much.
Okay, great, thank you. It's always difficult for these topics to be sort of interesting, but you made a very good exercise. They're more descriptive than other groups that look at the concrete cases or examples, but it's a very good presentation. Thank you very much. So let's now take a look at the at the AFMD directive. You will feel pretty much at ease with these concepts because, as I told you a few minutes ago, we take them up from, most of them are taken up from the UCITS directive. First of all, bear in mind that the AFMD directive is much newer than the UCITS directive. It is one of the several responses to the financial crisis of 2008-2009, and in fact, the directive was approved in 2011. If you think about how ancient the UCITS directive is, it's quite striking. More than 25 years have passed since the UCITS directive came into force, the first UCITS directive. And the scope of the AFMD is to complete the European regulation of investment funds. The UCITS directive had a huge impact on the market. The presentation that you saw, which goes back to 2013, the small video, said that the industry of UCITS in Europe was roughly 6 trillion euros. As of today, we are reaching probably 8 trillion euros, so it's a huge, huge, huge industry. But it is also an industry which is very big in size, but confined to a specific type of fund, the UCITS fund with its typical features that you know very well by now: open-ended, retail market, and don't mess up with the presentations. Sorry. And the European legislation needed to be completed. So at that point, the European Commission had a very challenging task, because they had in front a very diversified market to regulate, all funds different from UCITS funds. You find all kinds of products in this market that we now call alternative investment funds. And this is simply an expression that we are using in the context of this new directive, just to say these are funds that are different from the UCITS funds. Alternative simply means different funds. And you find all sorts of funds in here. You find hedge funds, you find real estate funds, private equity funds with all their different declinations: traditional private equity, venture capital, social investment funds, infrastructural funds. Everything would fall into the scope of the AMF, Alternative Investment Management Funds Directive. And also, now people are thinking of setting up within the scope of the AFMD, of setting up funds that invest in crypto assets. And crypto assets funds, once certain issues in terms of transparency are solved, which are still being highly debated, not just in the European Union, but in the context of the US system as well, may very rightly fall within the scope of the Alternative Investment Fund Managers Directive. And this directive also includes credit funds that lend monies to the economy, just as a bank would do. These are becoming increasingly interesting in the context of managing non-performing loans that we expect to be a very severe problem come up as a consequence of the pandemics. So it's very broad, and the Commission had this huge task of saying, what we do with this, what shall we do with this market, which is so differentiated, fragmented, and they decided to take up an innovative approach. And the directive, therefore, only regulates fund managers. It does not regulate the single products, tendentially very, very different and diversified. It simply regulates the managers that would set up and manage funds that fall outside the scope of the UCITS directive, including eventually open-ended funds, but open-ended funds that do not meet the requirements of the UCITS regulations, okay? And so the big difference between AFMD and UCITS is precisely that AFMD does not regulate the funds. It does not regulate the product. It simply regulates the fund manager. And it provides rules on the access to the market for these fund managers, licensing, and we will see very quickly that the concepts that you follow in the area of alternative investment fund managers are very close to the ones that we already met in the context of UCITS. And there are virtually no provisions on the funds themselves within the scope of the AFMD. You may find in the AFMD just a couple of references to the fund itself, but they are very neutral and they are not sufficient to regulate the products. For instance, if you take a look at the second paragraph of this slide, it sort of sets out and remembers that there are certain rules concerning the use of leverage and also liquidity management under the AFM. These two topics were included in the directive as a response to the financial crisis, whereby we saw that during the crisis, alternative funds had issues of liquidity, and excess use of leverage may create risks in terms of financial stability. But these provisions are mostly of a light touch. And first of all, they are cross-sectorial. They apply to any kind of alternative investment funds, and so they are insufficient to sort of provide a regulation of the fund itself. And second, they mostly insist on the transparency of these criteria. There are no specific, for instance, limits as to the leverage that a fund may use, but the fund must provide adequate ex-ante information to the investors as to how it would use leverage and to what extent. So ultimately, we end up with a scope of the directive that applies to all EU managers, fund managers, that we would then call alternative investment fund managers, that manage an alternative investment fund. And a very innovative concept that we find in the directive is that it's extraterritorial scope of application, because as you see on the slide, the directive also applies to non-EU managers based outside the European Union that manage an EU fund. For instance, you can think of a fund manager based in New York that manages a fund which is based in France, and also to non-EU fund managers that market their product within the European Union. So if you have a fund manager based in for instance, in Canada or in the United States or in Singapore, and this manager wants to market its fund in Europe, it must comply as a fund manager with the AFM provision. Okay, so it's the first time ever that we see this extraterritorial application of European financial law. And this was a very controversial part of the discussion of the AFMD. It also triggered sort of a clash with the US Treasury, because the US market players were not happy with the idea of being captured by European regulation applicable not to the product, because the tricky point is that European legislation would then apply not just to the product or not to the product itself, but to the fund manager, simply because they are marketing their shares, the shares of their funds into Europe. But ultimately, this is what we ended up, and it's quite interesting. So you see the definition of what an alternative fund is, the second part of the slide, is very broad. On the one side, you have a definition of what a fund is, which is quite close to the one that we met in the UCITS context. It is an undertaking that raises capital from a number of investors and then invests these funds in accordance with a defined investment policy for the benefit of those investors. It's very broad, and since the AFM doesn't regulate the products, the defined investment policy is really left up to national legislation or to the fund rules. And in fact, it is then up to national law to regulate the different funds that might fall within the scope of the directive. Ultimately, for instance, you have real estate funds regulated under Italian law that are very different from real estate funds regulated by French law or by German law, and this applies across the whole range of products that would fall under the AFMD. And the second concept is that this directive simply its scope of application is simply set out as being that of funds that do not require authorization pursuant to Article 5 of the UCITS directive. So it's a negative scope of application. The directive says this directive shall apply to any fund that does not fall within the scope of the AFMD. Also, in terms of the legal structure of the funds, we saw that in the context of the UCITS directive, we basically have contractual funds and statutory funds. And then we have the trust structure, which is typical of the UK system or Anglo-American system, but that's pretty close to the contractual fund structure, conceptually speaking. Legally speaking, trusts are different from contractual funds, but from a financial law perspective, they can be sort of easily compared. But in the AFM, you find that national law within the member states really provides different legal forms for setting up alternative investment funds, not just contractual funds and not just statutory funds as identified under the UCITS. You remember that in the UCITS we have statutory funds which are corporations with a variable capital. In the AFMD, you have corporations as well, which are licensed, which are recognized under national law as funds, but with a fixed capital. And different kind of corporations, not just the kind that would fall under the UCITS, but potentially very diversified. So the market for the European landscape and the European market of alternative investment funds is very diversified, much more than the UCITS context, and we simply have common rules on the managers of these funds and not on the funds themselves. In the AFMD, you find most of the typical exemptions that you find in other areas of European financial legislation. For instance, central banks, governments, whether national, regional, or local, are exempted from the directive. But apart from that, which is pretty straightforward by now, because you have quite a significant experience by now on these topics after being here for so long, the most interesting part of these exemptions concerns holding companies. And this is a very complicated area of the AFMD, which is now under revision. There is a discussion for a possible revision of the directive, because holding companies really pose a problem of distinguishing them from private equity funds. A holding company is simply a company that has a portfolio of investments in other companies. And if you look at it, it may seem very close to an investment fund, to a private equity fund especially. So how would you distinguish a holding company that it is reasonable to leave under, the general corporate law and not bring it within the scope of financial markets legislation that is there to protect investors that operate on the market? How do you distinguish that? This is a very difficult exercise. I don't want you to bother with the details, but I just want you to think that the broad approach of the AFM, of the AFMD, does raise issues of identifying what is effectively falling within its scope and what is instead outside the scope. And I think that holding companies are a good example to understand how tricky this might get. It might be very difficult to understand whether that company, which has a diversified portfolio, is a holding company or a private equity fund. So ultimately, what we end up by doing is to really sort of look very closely at this definition, raise capital from a number of investors, and investing those capitals with a defined investment policy. And there are guidelines. The ESMA has considered it absolutely necessary to issue guidelines to specify these elements of the alternative investment fund definition, to clarify its scope, also vis-a-vis the exemption for holding companies or other phenomena that might sort of be on the borderline between funds and other undertakings, which should not fall within the scope of the directive. When the AFMD was discussed, the industry across Europe was very unhappy with the approach of the Commission. And many complaints were raised by the UK fund managers. As you are aware, the UK is a very important marketplace for hedge funds, for private equity funds, and similar kinds of funds. Many of these market players are small. you shouldn't think simply or just in terms that, you know, this is an industry which is occupied by global players such as BlackRock. They are huge giants. It's made up of small fund managers, very specialized boutique fund managers. And these people were very much concerned with being subject to a regime that would drive them in terms of costs of compliance out of the market. And so the Commission ultimately carved into the AFMD a partial exemption for small fund managers. And you see this in slide number 7. It's a partial exemption. These smaller fund managers, and what is a small fund manager is defined depending on the portfolio that they are managing. It's 100 million euros or 500 million euros. And so these are considered to be small fund managers, and they benefit from a partial exemption from the AFMD. That results in lighter compliance requirements, less restrictive, for example, in terms of internal organization, internal control functions. And also it results in the fact that these smaller fund managers only have to register within their national authority. They do not require a formal authorization. And this is another important simplification, because these smaller market players simply need to notify that they exist and they register with the national authority, but they do not receive a formal authorization from their national supervisor, and this is a facilitation that reduces timing and also costs for accessing the market vis-a-vis the smaller market players. Okay. Basically, apart from the smaller fund managers, which are now in this lighter regime that has no equivalent in the UCITS directive. There is no such distinction between small and larger undertakings in that directive, but here it is very important because the industry is completely different from that of the UCITS environment. The conditions that are required for obtaining the authorization in the AFM environment are the same, conceptually the same that you find in the UCITS environment. So you have to, the fund manager must have sufficient initial capital. You find the typical rules on the requirements of the management body, the shareholders of the company. You see that the minimum capital for an AFM manager is pretty low. This is the standard amount, but member states are allowed to reduce these requirements for the smaller fund managers, and at that point you will find lower requirements. For instance, in Italy, if you set up an alternative fund manager, which is in the small regime, the smaller size regime, and this is a fund which is a statutory fund, all you need to have is the general minimum capital required by ordinary company law, which is 50,000 euros. It's pretty small. So you see, access to the market for these alternative fund managers is pretty easy in terms of capital requirements. If big fund managers have a requirement which is only of 125,000 euros, and there is an additional capital requirement that depends on the assets under management, but cannot go above, in any case, 10 million euros. Now, as far as I know, this additional requirement is really quite sort of bearable, because I know of no market player, even the big ones, that have reached the 10 million total cap requirement provided by the directive. And the reason why the AFM is structured in this way is that, if you think about it, for a fund manager, you do not really have upon the fund manager itself an issue of financial stability, because the fund's assets are segregated and the fund is separate from the funds of the fund manager. So it's quite different from what you find, for instance, in banks or in investment services, because the segregation of the fund's assets greatly resolves most of the issues that are typically addressed by traditional minimum capital oriented legislation. In the context of the AFM, you find conduct of rules that mirror the ones that you find in the UCITS context and that mirror the ones that you find in the MiFID context. This is one of the areas where, if you read this slide with MiFID in mind, you clearly see that managers of alternative investment funds are subject to rules that in principle are pretty close to the ones that you find in the MiFID environment. Another area which was very much discussed and debated in the context of the AFMD preparation was remuneration. And the idea that we now have, the solution that we now have, is that both in UCITS and in AFM, we have rules on the remuneration of senior management and key functions within the fund. But for alternative fund managers, this was a shock at the time, because the industry was not prepared with the idea of having mandatory rules on remuneration, especially because these rules are sort of modeled on the ones that you find in CRD4 for banks. And ultimately, what we ended up by having, both in UCITS and in AFM, is regulating remuneration in a way which is similar to banks, but with a lighter touch. One of the biggest differences you find between fund remuneration rules, fund managers remuneration rules, and bank rules is that in the banking sector, in the banking regulation, you have a maximum cap between the variable remuneration and the fixed remuneration, which is 2 to 1. So the variable remuneration may not be more than twice the fixed remuneration, and this is one of the biggest limitations of banking remuneration strategies that you find. This limitation does not apply in the fund management industry, so it's a little bit more flexible, but this was very much debated, and also within the AFM you have a carve out from these provisions for smaller fund managers that do not need to follow these remuneration requirements, and this goes in line with the idea of having a more flexible and easy regime for smaller fund managements. Equally, there are rules on risk management, and this again was very much debated in the context of the AFMD, that require fund managers to have appropriate risk management structures and also structures for the proper evaluation of the assets. And then you find a whole set of rules on the depository that sort of repeat what I have been saying today on the UCITS directive, so I don't really need to go over these again. This is where you find this peculiarity that in the AFM, has opened up the depository functions to MiFID investment firms and UCITS depositories as well. But as I told you, this is not effectively something that's being used by the market. We still have EU credit institutions as being the main market players for this kind of functions, and the duties of a depository on the AFM are similar to the ones that you find in the UCITS. Naturally, if you become very granular and you start reading all the differences between AFM and UCITS, you find differences, but I don't want you to be concerned with that, because you would have to go too much into the depth of this provision. And liability profiles are probably more precisely regulated in the AFMD context than in the UCITS context, but the principles are the same. So just take a look at this slide in terms of liability of the depository. And ultimately, you naturally have in the AFMD as you do find in the UCITS directive, rules concerning transparency and information of investors. These are pretty straightforward, not difficult to understand. Ex ante disclosure to investors, there are standards as to the level of information that must be provided to investors before they acquire the units of the fund, and then ex post minimum standards for transparency in terms of, for instance, annual report and the contents of this annual report that alternative investment funds must provide. Okay, so I will stop here. I'm just 1 minute late, sorry, and I will leave the floor to the group for its presentation. Thank you.
Perfect. Can you hear me, Professor?
Yeah, very well.
Okay, I will try sharing really fast. Let's see if it works, the PowerPoint. Okay, can you see the slides moving?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, great. I will resume for the first slide, and I will leave a word at this point to my colleague Gian.
So good morning, everyone. Can you see me and hear me well?
Yes, good morning.
So good morning. So today we are gonna walk you through our presentation about the European Banking Authority and its role as a supervisor, trying to understand its powers, functions in the context of the European Banking Union. So first of all, we will start with a little introduction and trying to understand the history also of the European Banking Authority from its creation and key characteristics. Then we will go through the current framework in terms of powers and responsibility of bank regulation and supervision. And then we will dig into the European Banking Authority roles and powers in terms of supervision, and trying to also explain a little comparison about the different roles and supervisory powers between the European Banking Authority, the European Security and Market Authorities, and the European Central Bank. After that, we will focus our attention on the different synergies and inefficiencies between the roles about the European Banking Authority and the European Banking and the Banking Union. And finally, we will have a little focus on the future roles of the European Banking Authority on fintech and insolvency law regulation and supervision. So going to the next slide, first of all, what is the European Banking Authority? It is an independent EU authority that tries to ensure a consistent prudential regulation and supervision in the overall European banking system. It was created on the 1st January 2011 in the context of the European system of financial supervision, and it replaced the Committee of European Banking Supervisor in terms of responsibilities and tasks. So its main object is to try to ensure the maintenance of financial stability in the EU and to foster the integrity and efficiency of the banking sector in general. Regarding its main tasks, they are related to the creation of the European Single Rule Book, so that is fundamental for the harmonization of the prudential rules for financial institutions, the promotion of convergence in terms of supervisory practices, and also its assessment of risk and vulnerabilities in the EU banking sector is fundamental. Going to the next slide, we wanted to give you just a little overview about the history regarding the European Banking Authority and the Banking Union. So after the first wave of the crisis, there was the failure of the minimum harmonization principle that led to the creation of the Single Rule Book, the three ESAs, and the European Systemic Risk Board. After the second wave of the crisis, there was still a lack of common response that led to the establishment of the banking union, so that also there was the establishment of the responsibility of the ECB in terms of bank supervision. After that, it was the turn for the directives and regulation with the BBRD4 and CRD and CRR. And in 2016, there was the introduction of the Single Resolution Fund, where financial institutions and investment firms had to give contribution to have a more resilient system in the end. So just to give you the key characteristic of the European Banking Authority and the Banking Union, so we know that after the proposal of the Commission and the recommendation of the De La Rosière report, there were the European Banking Authority, the European Security and Market Authorities, and the European Insurance Occupational Pensions Authorities that were created. And they had full legal personality, structure and budget, and also quasi-regulatory power. And they replaced the previous system of informal committees that was existent. Regarding the banking union composition, we know that it is composed by the three main pillars that are the single supervisory mechanisms that is fundamental for the division of the supervision of significant banks under the control of the ECB and non-significant banks under the control of national competent authorities, the single resolution mechanism that is important for the resolution of failing banks in order to not have cost on taxpayers and real economy, and then also the European Deposit Insurance Scheme, although this is not still mutualized at the moment. With that, I will leave the floor to Andrea in order to tell you about the current framework.
Perfect. Thank you, Gianmarco. Can you hear me and see me well? Can you hear me?
Hear you. Yes, yes.
Yes,
you can hear you. It's okay. Yeah.
Perfect. Sorry, I didn't hear you. So thank you, Gianmarco, for this straight introduction. So where did all this innovation and changes bring us to? Here in these slides, we want to summarize the current legal framework on the topic of banking regulation and ongoing supervision. As you can see, we have the EBA as a regulator and the ECB as a supervisor, a country pertaining to the banking union, and therefore in the euro area, while for the others, we know that national competent authorities are in place. This gives a clear picture of the current framework where the EBA operates. However, as we all know, and as we're going to highlight in the rest of the presentation, reality is not such a clear cut. And in the next slides, we are going to get deeper on the role of the EBA as supervisory convergence authority in the context of the banking union. Before getting to that, however, let me spend a few words on the EBA main organizational bodies and their roles. The EBA has four main bodies, which are the Board of Supervisors, the main decision-making body, the Management Board, which ensures that the EBA carries out its missions and performs its tasks assigned to it in accordance with the regulation, the Resolution Committee, empowered to make decisions on the resolution of financial institutions, and finally the Anti-Money Laundering and Counter-Terrorist Financing Committee, which is a newly formed committee to address specifically these topics. Moreover, if you look to the right of the slide, the ESAs operate in joint committees on the issues of cross-sectoral relevance and have a common board of appeal to which actors influenced by their decision can refer to. Finally, the EBA is externally represented by a chairperson and an executive director. Having said so, I leave the word to Nicolò, who will present the specific roles and supervisory convergence power of the EBA.
Okay. Andrea, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you. Yes.
Okay. Can you see me? Okay. Okay. Now let's go to the rules and objectives of EBA. According to the regulation of European Parliament of November 2010, the EBA has to improve the functioning of internal market with regard to the regulation and supervision. It also has to increase the supervisory coordination and ensure integrity, efficiency, transparency of financial market. Moreover, it has to ensure that the taking of risk are regulated and supervised. So, to reach these objectives, the EBA can use instruments such as binding technical standard, guideline, recommendation, opinion, report, and Q&A. To summarize the rules of EBA, we can group into customer protection and financial innovation, regulation, and oversight, which is composed by supervisory convergence and risk analysis. In particular, to ensure supervisory cooperation and convergence between competent supervisory authority, it can issue technical standard and guidelines, such as the SREP framework and the single supervisory handbook. The second one is a collection of supervisory best practice. However, it cannot reach the maximum harmonization since it's not binding. Moreover, EBA monitor and oversee the functioning of colleges that have an important role since they are vehicle through which the supervisory activities are coordinated. In the end, to ensure the supervisory convergence, it has an important tool that is the peer review, which compares the effectiveness of a supervisory activity and their implementation between competent authority in order to identify the best practice and extend it to all UE countries. Carry out his rule of supervision of supervisor, EBA also investigate breaches or non-application of UE law and set disagreement between competent authority, issue recommendation or taking decision. Okay, now let's go to the second element of the oversight. thereby in particular has to monitor market and market development and identify the risk and vulnerability in the UA banking sector. To do that, it initiates and coordinates the UA-wide stress test every 2 years. That is a bottom-up exercise. So every bank has to compute the stress test, then the National Supervisory Authority check the results, and in the end, EBA check the consistency of data from the National Supervisory Authority. EBA also does the supervisory benchmark exercise in relation to the assessment of internal model done by the competent authority, and in particular, this model are used to compute the own fund of banks, and the EBA in detail provides report which benchmark that help identify any material difference in the risk-weighted asset outcome. Okay, now I leave the floor again to Andrea that will do a comparison between EBA and the national and the EFA. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. Hoping that you can hear me and see me again well. Now we know in detail. Now that we know in detail the specific tasks and power of the EBA regarding its supervisory roles, here in this table you can see a comparison we have compiled with the ECB and the ESMA. As you can see, the main supervisory competencies of the EBA relate to the topic of supervisory convergence, which is defined as the consistent implementation and application of the same rules using similar approaches across all of the 27 member states of the EU. All of this with the main objective to ensure a level playing field for all the actors involved. The EBA does this, as you can see in the bottom left corner, issuing guidelines, peer reviews, mediation decisions, and giving a recommendation to the relevant sanctioning bodies in case of breach. As you can see in the upper table, all the other supervisory powers are granted either to the ECB in the context of a BU or to the national competent authorities. This with the exception of a stress test Nicola was talking about, this initiative where the EBA initiates and coordinates the activity done by the NCAs. It's interesting to note that the ESMA, in its respective topics of competence, which are credit rating agencies, securitization repositories, and trade repositories, much more supervisory of me with respect to the EBA. Carrying on and focusing now on the main point of this presentation on the topic regarding the interplay between the EBA and the BU, the main question we asked ourselves when researching on this issue were review and do this organization have in the end overlapping goals? Are there inefficiencies on how they operate? The answer is yes to the first question. The EBA still maintains its reason to be, and it does not have overlapping goal with the BU. In fact, the EBA provides, with its building of a single rulebook, a common and horizontally ground, which in the end allows for the smooth functioning of SSM and SRM, which in turn provide a common harmonized vertical integration mechanism with regards to the supervision. So we can characterize them as mutually reinforcing driver towards harmonization in the European Union. However, the advent of the banking union still had profound effects on many aspects of the EBA, creating possible inefficiencies and open question marks. I leave the word to my colleague Giulio to get deeper on this topic. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me and see me well?
Yes.
Okay, great. Now we will consider the inefficiencies of the European Banking Authority that were created by the introduction of the banking union. The first one is that the fact that the introduction of banking union, on one hand, completely eliminated the need of promoting a coordination of national competent authorities and national resolution authorities inside the union, while on the other, it increased the importance of these activities between banking union and non-banking union countries in order to avoid the polarization of the single market and to facilitate cross-border banking operations. The second problem is the fact that the introduction of the banking union increased the complexity of the European Banking Authority's governance. Indeed, before its introduction, the Board of Supervisors used to vote by simple or qualified majority in case of regulations. Instead, after the creation of the banking union, introduced. This rule of both is required in order to achieve a qualified of both Bulgaria and Croatia, this governance problem may become prominent. The third problem is the fact that the creation of the banking union led to the fact that currently is not clear the legal scope of the European Banking Authority action as a mediator, nor if the exercise of its discretionary power is legitimate as such. Hence, a clearer and more detailed framework is needed on these matters. The last and fourth problem is the fact that a clear framework is also needed regarding the relationship and subject matters of legislative acts and technical standards, which many types overlap. In this presentation, with a focus on some of the EBA future focus areas. The first one is the FinTech and financial innovation regulation and supervision. Indeed, the European Banking Authority is entitled to monitor financial innovation and to provide an early assessment on different risks that can be generated by it. For this reason, in 2018, the EBA developed the FinTech roadmap, setting out the priorities that it should follow until 2020. These priorities included a wide range of action to support the spread of innovative technology, while also ensuring, first, a high standard of financial sector operational resilience, and secondly, a high standard of consumer protection. Two new regulation proposals have been set forward. The first one is the MiCA, which gives the European Banking Authority powers to supervise and regulate the issues of asset-backed crypto assets. And the second one is the DORA, which gives the EBA powers and security risk management.
Okay, thank you. I think it's we are over with the time, and
is the one of
I think you should stop here. It's a very interesting presentation. Both presentations today were, I think, very, very good, excellent, and you did a great job. The topic was a little bit sort of sterile when you have to describe. You don't have a concrete case to discuss. It may prove to be different, but you did a truly outstanding job, both of the groups today. Okay, so we have to stop here, and happy